Hi, I'm Lisa from Lori's Country Cottage. Welcome to How Tuesdays. Today I'm going to show you how to make the June Taylor Quilt As You Go Christmas tree skirt. Okay, let's talk supplies. What do you need to make your Quilt As You Go Christmas tree skirt? Well, the first thing you need is the foundation from June Taylor. So in your package, you get this pre-printed foundation and a template for cutting your pieces. You'll need some spray starch. I have Best Press in this bottle to stabilize all the fabrics that you've chosen because we are making bias cuts. So it's really important to stabilize your fabric first with Best Press. We also need 505 spray. We're going to use the 505 to attach our batting foundation to our backing. And you'll need a friction marker if you choose to do your cutting like I do. Let me show you the fabrics that the girls at the store picked out for me. These are some great Christmas fabrics for my tree skirt. So I've chosen, or they have chosen for me, 4 fabrics. You can use 4 to 6 fabrics. I guess you could use even more if you like. They chose 4 for me. Plus, we are going to do a bias cut binding. So this is going to be great. My lines will be running diagonal. And then this is my backing for my tree skirt. So in the instructions for fabric that you require, she suggests that you buy a ½ yard of 4 to 6 fabrics. And here's what I say about that. If you're buying, I need 16 wedges and I have 4 fabrics, so I need 4 wedges from each fabric. So doing a little bit of math and figuring, I can actually get my 4 pieces out of 0.4. But here's the thing, if you did 6 fabrics and you bought a ½ meter of 6 fabrics, you can get 6 pieces out of each piece, and that's enough for 2 tree skirts. So just keep the math in mind. 0.4 gives you 4 wedges. 0.5 actually gives you 6 wedges. So if you want to make more than one, purchase a ½ meter of 6 different fabrics, 2 packages of foundation, and you'll have enough for 2 tree skirts. Let's move on now to cutting and preparing our foundation piece. Okay, let's prepare the backing for our Quilt As You Go tree skirt. So what I've done is I've spray starched my backing to give it some stability. I've laid it wrong side up on my surface. I've taken the foundation out of the package. Be sure not to iron or press the foundation. It says right in the instructions that that can distort the foundation, and we need this to lie perfectly flat. I've trimmed my foundation 1 inch away from the outside line. I just laid my ruler on top, took my rotary cutter and just kept cutting 1 inch all the way around to trim off the extra fabric. We don't need that, that's just in the way. So we want to now stick our foundation down to the wrong side of our backing. So as an illustration, if you ever use spray-based for your quilts, this is how I would actually do an entire quilt. It would just be on, of course, a bigger platform. I work in halves. So I'm going to work first with this half of my backing. Take my spray and make sure I cover the first half and lay my foundation down and smooth it out, making sure not to stretch it at all, and then just peel back that piece that you haven't done. And again, put your 505 on. If you're working on your kitchen or something, make sure to make a protective barrier between your floors and the 505. Or just know that you have to wash your floors when you're done. All right, I'm gonna do the other half spray basting, and then I'll come back and show you how to cut your fabric for your tree skirt. Okay, let's do some cutting. First of all, I've layered 2 of my fabrics. When I cut, that'll only be 4 layers of fabric to cut. So just to save some time, I'm going to cut more than 1 layer at a time. I don't want to use this plastic template as my cutting surface to lean against, because inevitably I'm going to cut into that plastic and then my template isn't the right size anymore and my pieces aren't nice. So I can actually, I could take my friction marker and I could draw a line all the way around this template, but I'm going to do it a little bit different. I want to show you also the lines on the template. If you're using a stripe, you can use those lines to line up your stripe, and I'm actually going to do that with my plaid here. I'll make sure that I'm nice and straight, line up my black squares on that line, so I know that my template now is square. I'm going to put a dot at each corner, and then I'm going to use my ruler to join the dots. Didn't make that one bright enough. All right, so I'll just slide my template out of the way. There's my dot there. And my dot here. So I'm going to line up those 2 dots and make a cut with my rotary cutter, and then just slide these out of the way so I don't have them in the way. And then I'm going to join those 2 dots. And because I have a cutting surface that I can walk around, I'm just going to walk around to this side of my cutting surface and make that cut. Now, if you can't walk around your cutting surface, you just have to flip your pieces. I like to keep, excuse me, the piece that I'm going to keep underneath my ruler, so if I make a mistake, this is the garbage. So now I can join these 2 dots and cut off the bottom and the 2 dots at the top. A little bit of overkill with that ruler. And cut off the top. And there are my first pieces. Now I'll flip my template. Again, use these lines to line up my fabric. And there's no use wasting, so I'll just shuffle it over. And I could just move my template against this line. Technically that should be straight, and it's pretty good, but I want to be able to see my dots, so I'm just going to shuffle it over a wee bit and do the same process. I'm going to make my 4 dots. I'm going to line up my ruler and cut that out, and I'll just show you there's enough room for my 3rd cut if I wanted. So I'm going to keep cutting out all my pieces, then I'll come back and show you what the next step is. All right, it's time to get sewing. The next step is to stitch some placement lines on your foundation. There's a dashed line all the way around the tree skirt. There's a dashed line between pieces 1 and 16, and then a dashed line around the inside. And the instructions say to baste on that line, and that's going to be a cutting line when we have all our pieces on top. And that brings me to thread. When you do quilt as you go, whatever thread is in your bobbin is going to show on the back of your piece. So make sure you match it or contrast it with purpose. So I clearly have matched my thread to the backing. So my stitching will be almost invisible on the back. All right, here's my piece number 1. I've decided the order of my wedges. It'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll be back at the beginning. So this wedge is clearly marked piece number 1. I'm going to lay my first piece along this line. So this is not a stitching line, this is a placement line. And there are lines on the outside to help me line it up and lines on the inside to help me line it up. So there is piece number 1. When I have that on there, I'm going to grab my piece number 2. You could pin at this point, but I don't think it's going to move because it kind of sticks to the batting. Piece number 2 goes right on top, lining up those edges. Because remember, that's a placement line, not a stitching line. And now I'm going to pin that down. Now I'm going to try not to pin all the way through that backing. I'm going to try just to catch the batting just a bit. I don't want to pinch or create a pleat or a fold in that back. So I'm going to try just to catch those top layers, and I'm just going to throw one more right at the beginning so that's flat. All right, now I'm going to go to my sewing machine and I'm going to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Let me show you how that's done. All right, here I am at my sewing machine. I have my 1/4 inch foot on, and I'm going to stitch not with a basting stitch, but actually with a regular, on my machine it's a 2.5. My needle is in the down position, and I'm just stitching with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now my machine has a built-in even feed foot or walking foot. If your machine doesn't have a built-in even feed foot, I suggest you stitch this with your walking foot. And find your accurate 1/4 inch by moving your needle to do this stitching. Also, there's quite a bit of bulk on the right-hand side of my project, so I've rolled it up so that it's easier to work with. And it's simply a matter of stitching with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm not going to back stitch at the end because that's going to be stitched over. Let's move back to the working table and I'll show you what the next step is. All right, here we are on to the next step. So I'm simply going to take piece number 2 and flip it open and gently finger press that seam. Now we can't go to the iron because she said it may distort the foundation, and I don't want to yank it because again, these are biased edges, so I can really manipulate it, but I feel that that lays nice and flat, and much to my amazement, it lines up exactly on the placement line. So here comes piece number 3. I'm going to, again, lay it right sides together along the placement line with my piece number 2. Put some pins in, trying to just catch my fabric and a little bit of that batting so it doesn't shift. I'm going to go back to my sewing machine, stitch this piece, and then just continue flipping, adding, sewing, flipping, adding, sewing, all the way around till I get to the beginning. All right, I have all 16 pieces sewn onto my foundation. Here's some tips when putting your pieces on. If you go to lay on one of your wedges and you notice that the piece before isn't quite lined up with that placement line, always line the new piece with the placement line and stitch a 1/4 inch from the edge of that piece. And that way you're straightening up your work for the next wedge. So all of my pieces are on. This is piece number 1, and here's piece number 16. Our next step is to flip the whole tree skirt over and cut on those original basting lines, which includes a line in between piece 1 and piece 16. So I need to pin these down. I don't like to use pins when I know I'm going to use my rotary cutter, but I've pinned well away from that line. So I'm pinning piece number 1. Now I'm going to smooth my piece number 16 nice and flat. And I'm going to pin again well away from that cutting line. You'll also notice that I'm using flower-headed pins because I know I'm going to lay a ruler down, so I'd like to have nice flat pins. So I'm going to move on to the next step. I'm going to flip it over and cut on my original basting lines. All right, I've used my rotary cutter to trim along the basting that I did in one of the very first steps. And that included cutting the line between wedge number 1 and wedge number 16 and cutting out the inside circle. Let's see how this looks. There's my extra piece of number 1, and number 16 is tucked underneath there. I'm just going to flip this over so you can see what it looks like. All right, there's my tree skirt. Now you have the option at this time of doing decorative stitching or quilting if you like. If you have some lovely decorative stitches on your machine, you could stitch along these seam lines. You could stitch in the ditch if you like. It's actually just a decorative stitch at this point. This is totally functional as it is. If you had an embroidery machine, you could have pre-embroidered your fabric before you cut it ahead of time. You could choose to do quilting inside. If you have Westerly rulers, might be fun to do some decorative stitching. I didn't bring enough thread home with me to do that, so I'm not going to do any decorative stitching on this. The next step is to add my bias cut binding to the tree skirt. So today you get a bonus. There's a link below to a video of me creating my continuous bias cut binding. If you're not familiar with how to do binding, go ahead and watch that video and then come back and see how it's put on the tree skirt. So I'm back with my bias binding. And I read the pattern, and I need 2 pieces of binding, one 54-inch and one 180 inches. And I measured my binding, and I don't quite have enough. And I think that's because my original square wasn't big enough. I don't know if she uses a different method for bias binding, but what a great learning opportunity. Here's the other half of my binding fabric that I had after I cut my 24-inch square. So here's a second method of making binding strips. I don't need to make continuous bias binding a whole set because I don't need that much. So make a diagonal fold, bringing your 2 edges together. Now this is our stretchy or biased end. So fold matching this folded edge. I could have stopped there, but I'll make another fold just to show you. All right, so I've got all my folded edges together, and if I cut off that folded edge, lining a line with my ruler here and here. Remember, this is my biased edge. So now if I turn it and I cut a 2.5 inch strip, that is a bias strip. See how the lines are going diagonal? That's a bias strip. And I'm going to cut one more, but I don't think I'm going to need it, but I'll cut it just in case. There we go. So why do you use continuous bias binding? Because I have to piece these together. They're not sewn together. So I'm going to add 2 strips to my binding, and then I'll come back and show you the next step. All right, folks, here we are. Time for binding. So as I was reading the instructions, I thought, oh goodness, she's going to machine stitch the binding instead of doing hand stitched binding. And of course, the reason you would do that is because it simply saves time. And really, it's a tree skirt, who's gonna look at the back, blah, blah, blah. I really like hand stitched binding. I don't like to do machine stitch binding, but when I make a sample for the store, I follow the instructions. So when you are doing machine stitched binding, as opposed to hand stitched binding, your binding gets sewn onto the back of your quilt. So I've aligned the edge of my binding strip, which I have folded in half, just like regular binding. And I've stitched it from the center, and I left just a little tail that'll get it trimmed off. From the center, I've gone all the way around and back up to the center. So my binding is all stitched on. And now I'm going to take my Wonder clips, and I've already started because I wanted to show you how nicely that curved edge, just because it's a bias binding, how nicely that just curls around. So I'm going to take my binding clips and I'm going to clip all the way around. Now I'm making sure when I pull my binding to the front that I'm just overlapping my stitching line. So I'm going to clip this all the way around, and then I'm going to go to my machine and I'm going to edge stitch. And so what you're trying to do is stitch this down, of course, so that it's solid. And then you want your stitching to show up on the back inside your binding. So I'm going to change my thread color to green because I don't want a blue thread to show up here, and I'll be top stitching on top of my binding. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, come back, show you how it turns out, and then we'll finish the center. All right, I'm back with my binding stitched on, and I'll give you a nice close look. So this is the front with the edge stitch, and that's what it looks like on the back. It's actually not bad. So the front, and then how it looks on the back. So I'm quite pleasantly surprised with how the stitching looks. I still prefer hand stitching, but you know, it's a tree skirt and you don't see the back. So the only thing we have to do now is put binding on our inner circle. Which is here. Here's our inner circle. And she leaves tails to be a tie to hold your tree skirt on. And we're going to create our own double fold binding. So I took my binding strip and I folded it in half and I pressed it so that I have a center line. And then I fold my 2 halves into that center line and press it. And And I will just remind you here, in case you don't know, whenever you're working with biased edges, you shouldn't use steam because the water and the steam will create a waffling effect in your fabric. So the next step is to fold these folded edges together and give it a good press, creating double fold binding. Once that's pressed nice, we're going to measure 18-inch tails. So those will be the ties. And then we're going to clip this to the center circle of the tree skirt. I really miss using steam when I work with bias edges because I just feel like my seams are so much more crisp. All right, so here's my inner circle. I'm going to leave about 18 inches and then lay that double fold binding like that. Clip it with my Wonder clips all the way around, and look how nice that lays with the biased edges. I'm going to stitch this down starting at the very beginning of this tail, stitch along the edge, top stitch, catching that second folded edge on the bottom. I'll be back to show you what that looks like. So I've got my double fold bias tape sewn to the center circle. Here are my ties. She leaves the ends raw and has you tie a knot on the end. So all you do is tie a bow in your strings, and that would keep your tree skirt hanging on your tree. Thanks for joining me today for How Tuesdays. I hope you enjoyed my video on the Quilt As You Go tree skirt by June Taylor. This is the third project I've done from June Taylor Quilt As You Go. I did the Tory tote as well as the Venice placemats, and I really enjoy the projects. I find the instructions really well written, and I hope you enjoy making some too. Thanks for joining me.